The morning sun was gentle over Madison Square Park in New York City. It was a Saturday in late September, and the park was alive with people. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children chased pigeons near the fountain. Young couples walked hand in hand along the winding paths. Street performers had already claimed their usual spots, hoping to collect enough coins to make the day worthwhile. Near the eastern entrance of the park stood an old upright piano. The city had placed it there as part of a public art project called Play Me on Yours. The idea was simple. Anyone could sit down and play. Over the summer months, hundreds of people had touched those worn keys. Some played beautifully. Others just banged out random notes for fun. But by September, the piano had seen better days. The white keys had turned yellow. Some black keys were chipped. The sound was slightly out of tune. Most serious musicians walked past it without a second glance. On this particular Saturday morning, a man appeared at the edge of the park. He moved slowly, almost carefully, as if each step required thought. He was thin, with deep lines carved into his face. His hair was gray and uncombed, sticking out from beneath a faded baseball cap. He wore an old brown jacket that was too big for his narrow shoulders. His pants were wrinkled and stained. His shoes had holes near the toes. He carried a small plastic bag that seemed to hold everything he owned in the world. People noticed him, but only briefly. In a city like New York, you learn not to stare. You learn to look away from things that make you uncomfortable. Mothers pulled their children a little closer. Businessmen checked their phones and walked faster. The man was invisible to most of them. Just another forgotten soul drifting through a city that had no room for people who had fallen through the cracks. The man walked deeper into the park. His eyes were searching for something, though nobody knew what. He passed the fountain without looking at the water. He ignored the hot dog vendors and the pretzel carts. He did not stop to rest on any of the benches. He just kept walking until he reached the old piano. He stood in front of it for a long time. His eyes studied every scratch on its surface. His fingers trembled slightly at his sides. Something changed in his face. The tired, empty expression softened into something else, something that looked almost like love. He reached out and touched the piano gently. The way a person might touch the face of someone they had lost long ago. A group of teenagers sat on a nearby bench. They were laughing loudly, taking videos on their phones, completely unaware of the man standing just a few feet away. One of them, a boy with bright red headphones around his neck, noticed the old man staring at the piano. He nudged his friends and pointed. They all looked. Smiles spread across their faces. Not kind smiles. The kind of smiles that come before laughter. The man did not notice them. He was lost in his own world. Slowly, he walked around to the bench and sat down. The wood creaked under his weight. He placed his plastic bag on the ground beside him. Then he lifted his hands and held them above the keys. They hovered there, shaking slightly. The teenagers burst into laughter. One of them held up a phone to record. Another shouted something cruel that got lost in the wind. Other people in the park began to notice. A woman with a stroller stopped walking. Two men in business suits paused their conversation. A street artist put down his paintbrush. Everyone was watching now. A security guard who worked in a nearby building stepped closer. He was a large man with tired eyes and a thick mustache. His job was to keep the area safe, and right now he was not sure what was about to happen. He had seen people do strange things at that piano before. Once, a drunk man had tried to sleep inside it. Another time, someone had spray-painted graffiti on the side. He crossed his arms and watched the old man carefully. The man at the piano seemed frozen. His hands still hovered above the keys. He closed his eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was remembering. Nobody knew. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. One of the teenagers shouted again. "Hey, old man. You gonna play or what? This isn't a museum." His friends laughed even harder. More phones came out. More people gathered. The crowd was growing now. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. Most looked ready to laugh at whatever was about to happen. Then, something unexpected occurred. The old man opened his eyes. He looked out at the crowd gathered around him. He saw their faces. He saw the phones pointed at him. He saw the mocking smiles and the raised eyebrows. And instead of shrinking back, instead of getting up and walking away, he did something remarkable. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. It touched his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. For just a moment, he looked like a completely different person. He looked like a man who knew something that nobody else in that park could possibly understand. The security guard uncrossed his arms. Something in the old man's expression made him pause. The teenagers stopped laughing, suddenly unsure. The woman with the stroller leaned forward. The two businessmen forgot about their conversation. Even the pigeons seemed to stop moving. The old man turned back to the piano. He rolled his shoulders once, twice. He stretched his fingers wide, then curled them into loose fists, then opened them again. These were the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. These were the movements of a professional. He took one long, deep breath. The park fell completely silent. Even the noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then his fingers touched the keys. The first note rang out across the park. It was a single note, pure and clear, cutting through the September air like a knife through silk. It hung there for a moment, beautiful and lonely. And then came the second note. And the third. And then, like a river breaking free from a dam, the music began to pour out of the old piano. It filled every corner of the park. It rose above the trees and drifted across the city. It was unlike anything anyone there had ever heard before. The teenagers lowered their phones. Their mouths fell open. The security guard took a step back, his eyes wide. The woman with the stroller put a hand over her heart. People stopped walking. People stopped talking. People stopped breathing, because what they were hearing was impossible. It was impossible that such beautiful music could come from such an old, broken piano. It was impossible that such skilled hands could belong to such a poor, forgotten man. Everything they thought they knew was being turned upside down right in front of their eyes, and the old man just kept playing. The music filled the park like water filling a glass. It started softly, gently, almost shyly. Bobby was testing himself, feeling out the old piano, reacquainting himself with an instrument he had not touched in years. His fingers moved slowly at first, picking out a simple melody that floated on the morning air. A woman named Jennifer Hayes was walking through the park when the music reached her ears. She was a busy accountant, always rushing from one place to another. She had no time for street performers. She had no patience for distractions. But something about this music made her stop. It sounded different. It sounded real. She turned toward the piano and pushed through the gathering crowd. What she saw confused her at first. An old homeless man sitting at a cheap public piano, playing music that belonged in a concert hall. Her brain could not make sense of it. She stood frozen, her coffee growing cold in her hand. Bobby had moved past the simple melody now. His confidence was growing. His fingers remembered what his mind had tried to forget. They danced across the keys with increasing speed and precision. The notes came faster and faster, building into something magnificent. He was playing Chopin. Ballade No. 1 in G minor. One of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. It requires absolute control, perfect timing, and emotional depth that few musicians ever achieve. Bobby had first learned this piece when he was 16. He had performed it at Carnegie Hall. He had recorded it 3 times. And now, after all these years, he was playing it again on a broken piano in a public park. The crowd continued to grow. People abandoned their morning routines. Dog walkers forgot about their dogs. Joggers stopped mid-stride. Families gathered their children and moved closer. Within 5 minutes, over 100 people surrounded the old piano. Within 10 minutes, the number had doubled. A young man named Marcus Williams was among the first to record the performance. Marcus was a jazz piano student at a nearby college. He knew music. He understood technique. And what he was hearing was impossible. This old man was playing with the skill of a world-class concert pianist. His touch was perfect. His phrasing was beautiful. His emotional connection to the music was so deep that Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes. Marcus aimed his phone at the piano and pressed record. He had no idea that this simple action would change everything. Bobby moved into the middle section of the ballade. This was the hard part. The part that separated good pianists from great ones. His fingers flew across the keys at impossible speeds. The melody soared and dove, climbed and crashed. It was a musical roller coaster, and Bobby was the master of every twist and turn. The security guard who had been watching with suspicion was now watching with wonder. His name was Gerald Washington, a 62-year-old grandfather who had never been to a concert in his life. He did not know Chopin from chopsticks, but he knew beautiful when he heard it. And this was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Gerald moved closer to the piano. He wanted to see this man's hands. He wanted to understand how such music was possible. When he saw those weathered fingers moving with such grace and precision, he shook his head in disbelief. In 40 years of working in the city, he had seen many strange things. But this was something else entirely. The crowd was completely silent now. No one spoke. No one moved. Phones were held up to record, but their owners had forgotten they were even there. Everyone was lost in the music. Everyone was transported to somewhere else. The busy city faded away. The problems of daily life disappeared. There was nothing left but the piano and the man who played it. Bobby approached the climax of the piece. His entire body was moving now, swaying with the rhythm. His eyes were closed tight. Sweat formed on his forehead. He was not playing the piano anymore. He was becoming the piano. He and the instrument were one single thing, creating sound together like two parts of the same soul. A woman in the crowd began to cry openly. She did not know why. She did not understand classical music. She had just been passing through on her way to brunch. But something about this moment broke through all her defenses and touched something raw and real inside her. Tears streamed down her face, and she did not even try to wipe them away. She was not alone. All around the park, people were experiencing the same thing. Hard businessmen blinked back tears. Tough teenagers swallowed lumps in their throats. Even the children stood perfectly still, sensing that something important was happening, even if they were too young to understand what. The climax hit like a thunderbolt. Bobby's hands crashed down on the keys, releasing a wave of sound that seemed to shake the very air. The music roared and swelled, powerful and unstoppable. It was triumph and tragedy wrapped together. It was loss and hope singing as one voice. It was everything that Bobby had been through, every pain and every joy, pouring out through his fingers. Then, just as suddenly as the storm had come, it began to quiet. The music softened. The notes became gentle again. Bobby was bringing the piece home, guiding it toward its conclusion. His touch was feather-light now, almost a whisper. Each note hung in the air like a falling leaf. The final notes arrived, simple and pure. They faded into silence. Bobby's hands rested on the keys for a long moment. Then he lifted them and placed them in his lap. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then Gerald Washington began to clap. His big hands came together slowly at first, then faster. The sound echoed across the park. Others joined in. The applause spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Within seconds, hundreds of people were clapping and cheering. Someone let out a loud whistle. Someone else shouted, "Bravo!" The sound was deafening. Bobby opened his eyes. He looked out at the crowd as if seeing them for the first time. The cheers and applause washed over him. He seemed confused at first, almost frightened. He had been so lost in the music that he had forgotten anyone was watching. Slowly, carefully, he stood up from the piano bench. His legs were shaky. His hands trembled at his sides. He looked at all the faces looking back at him. He saw the tears. He saw the smiles. He saw the phones pointed at him from every direction. For a long moment he just stood there. Then very slowly he bowed. It was a small bow, just a slight dip of his head. But it was the bow of a performer, the bow of a man who had once stood on the greatest stages in the world. In that simple gesture, a ghost of the old Bobby Carter appeared. The crowd exploded. The cheers grew even louder. People surged forward, wanting to shake his hand, wanting to touch him, wanting to be close to whatever magic they had just witnessed. Bobby took a step back, overwhelmed. Gerald quickly moved forward and created a buffer between the old man and the crowd. "Give him some space," Gerald shouted. "Back up, people! Give the man some room." But the crowd did not want to back up. They wanted more. They wanted answers. Who was this man? Where did he come from? How could someone who looked like he had nothing possess a talent that rivaled the greatest musicians on earth? Marcus lowered his phone, his heart still racing from what he had just recorded. He looked at the timestamp. 14 minutes and 33 seconds. He had captured the entire performance. Without knowing it, he had captured a moment that would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. Bobby stood beside the piano, surrounded by strangers, looking lost and found at the same time. He had not played in public for nearly 20 years. He had thought those days were gone forever. But here he was, standing in a park with applause ringing in his ears, feeling something he thought he would never feel again. He felt alive. Marcus Williams uploaded the video to social media that same afternoon. He titled it simply, "Homeless Man Asks to Play Piano in Park. What happens next will change your life." He added a few hashtags and pressed share. Then he went back to his normal Saturday routine, never imagining what he had just set in motion. By evening, the video had 10,000 views. By midnight, it had reached 100,000. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning, over 1 million people had watched the old man play Chopin in Madison Square Park. The comments came flooding in from every corner of the world. People shared the video with friends and family. News websites picked up the story. Television networks sent reporters to find the mysterious pianist. The internet was obsessed with one question: who was this man? The answer came from an unexpected source. A retired music professor in Boston named Dr. Helen Garrett was scrolling through her phone when her daughter sent her the video. Helen almost scrolled past it. She had seen too many fake viral videos to get excited anymore. But something made her stop and watch. Within 30 seconds, she knew. She did not need to see his face clearly. She did not need to hear his name. She recognized those hands. She recognized that style. She had watched this man perform at Carnegie Hall when she was a young graduate student. She had written her doctoral thesis on his interpretation of Romantic-era piano music. Her hands shook as she typed her comment. "This is Bobby Carter. He was one of the greatest pianists of his generation. He disappeared from public life almost 20 years ago. I thought he was dead." Helen's comment was buried among thousands of others at first. But then people began to search. They dug through old concert programs and newspaper archives. They found photographs and recordings. They compared the hands in the old images to the hands in the new video. Within hours, the confirmation spread across the internet like wildfire. The homeless man in the park was Bobby Carter, former classical piano virtuoso, winner of the International Chopin competition, once legendary performer at the world's greatest concert halls. The man who had been living on the streets for nearly 2 decades was the same man who had once been called the most gifted pianist of his generation. The story captured something deep in the public imagination. Here was a tale of talent and tragedy, of falling and rising, of being forgotten and found. It was the kind of story that people needed to believe in. It reminded them that beauty could exist in unexpected places, that talent could survive even the darkest circumstances, that second chances were possible. Bobby knew nothing about any of this. After his performance in the park, he had drifted away as quietly as he had come. He spent that night in a shelter on the Lower East Side, eating soup and bread, watching the other residents shuffle past. He did not own a phone. He did not watch television. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The reporters found him 3 days later. A young woman named Sarah, Chan from a local news station received a tip that the famous piano player had been seen entering a shelter on Bowery Street. She rushed over with a camera crew, her heart pounding with excitement. This was the story of the year. This was the story that would make her career. She found Bobby sitting on a cot in the corner, reading an old paperback book that someone had left behind. He looked up when she approached, his eyes wary and tired. "Mr. Carter?" she asked gently. "My name is Sarah Chun. I'm a reporter. May I speak with you?" Bobby stared at her for a long moment. He had not heard anyone call him Mr. Carter in years. It sounded like a name that belonged to someone else, someone from another lifetime. "I don't give interviews," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Please," Sarah pressed. "The whole world wants to know your story. Your video has been seen by millions of people. You've touched so many lives." Bobby's forehead creased with confusion. "Video? What video?" Sarah showed him her phone. She played the recording that Marcus had uploaded. Bobby watched himself play, seeing his own hands move across the keys, hearing the music that had flowed through him just days before. When the video ended, he sat in silence for a long time. "I didn't know anyone recorded that," he finally said. I just wanted to play. I hadn't played in so long. I saw the piano and I just wanted to remember what it felt like." "Mr. Carter," Sarah said softly, "people are calling this one of the greatest live performances they've ever witnessed. Critics are saying your playing was extraordinary. There are major orchestras asking about you. Concert halls want to book you. You're the biggest story in the country right now." Bobby looked down at his hands. Those old, weathered hands that had caused him so much pain for so many years. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching them move. "I was broken," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For a long time I was broken. My hands wouldn't work anymore. I lost everything. My career. My family. My home. I lost it all. What happened?" Sarah asked. "Why did you disappear?" Bobby told her. He told her about the arthritis that had stolen his gift. He told her about the anger and the depression that had driven away everyone who loved him. He told her about the fire that had destroyed his piano. He told her about the years on the street, the cold nights and hungry days, the feeling of being invisible in a city of millions. And then he told her about the miracle, about waking up one morning and realizing his hands could move again, about spending 3 years too afraid to hope, too afraid to try, about walking into the park that Saturday and seeing the old piano and knowing somehow that it was time. "I don't know why my hands came back," he said. "Maybe the cold weather helped. Maybe my body finally healed itself. Maybe God had other plans for me. I don't know. All I know is that when I sat down at that piano, it felt like coming home. Like everything I had lost was waiting there for me." Sarah was crying by the time he finished. Her camera operator was crying too. Everyone in the shelter who had gathered to listen was wiping their eyes. The interview aired that night on the evening news. By the next morning, Bobby Carter's name was known by everyone in America. Donations poured in from people who wanted to help him. Musicians offered to perform benefit concerts. Piano manufacturers offered him free instruments. A wealthy businessman in California offered to buy Bobby a house. The response was overwhelming. Bobby, who had spent so long being invisible, was suddenly the most visible person in the country. News crews camped outside the shelter. Fans gathered hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Letters and cards arrived by the thousands, but amid all the noise and attention, Bobby remained focused on one thing. He wanted to play again. Not for fame, not for money, just for the pure joy of making music. That was all he had ever really wanted. That was the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive. A week after the interview, Bobby received a letter that changed everything. It came in an elegant cream-colored envelope, addressed by hand in perfect script. The return address was from the Carnegie Hall Administration Office. With trembling fingers, Bobby opened the envelope and read the words inside. His eyes grew wide. His breath caught in his throat. He read the letter again, and then a third time, just to make sure he understood. Carnegie Hall was inviting Bobby Carter to perform on their legendary stage once again. They were offering him a solo concert, a full evening of music, broadcast live to audiences around the world. They wanted to give him the comeback of a lifetime. Bobby Carter, the homeless man who had made history in a public park, was going back to Carnegie Hall. His name was Robert Allen Carter, but there was a time when the world knew him simply as Bobby Carter. Born in the winter of 1958, he came into the world in a tiny apartment in the Bronx. His mother worked 2 jobs cleaning offices. His father drove a delivery truck 6 days a week. They had nothing extra. No savings. No safety net. But they had love, and for a while, that was enough. The piano came into Bobby's life by accident. He was 4 years old when his mother took him to clean the apartment of a wealthy widow on the Upper East Side. While his mother scrubbed floors and polished silver, little Bobby wandered into the living room. There, standing against the wall like a sleeping giant, was a grand piano. Bobby had never seen anything so beautiful. The black wood shone like a mirror. The white keys looked like a perfect row of teeth. He walked toward it slowly, his small feet barely making a sound on the carpet. He reached up and pressed one key. The sound that came out made him gasp. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever heard. The widow found him there an hour later. His mother was terrified, certain they would be fired. But the old woman just smiled. She sat down beside the boy and began to play. Bobby watched her fingers dance across the keys, creating sounds that seemed to come from another world. When she finished, she looked at him with kind eyes. "Would you like to learn?" she asked. That single question changed everything. The widow, whose name was Eleanor Price, became Bobby's first teacher. Every Saturday, while his mother cleaned the apartment, Bobby sat at the grand piano and learned. He learned scales and chords. He learned timing and rhythm. He learned how to read the strange black dots on paper and turn them into music. Eleanor had once been a concert pianist herself, before arthritis took her career. Now she poured everything she knew into this small boy from the Bronx. Bobby was a natural. By age 6, he could play Beethoven. By 8, he had mastered Mozart. By 10, he was performing at school concerts and church events, stunning audiences with his tiny hands and enormous talent. Word spread quickly. People began to talk about the miracle child from the Bronx who played piano like an angel. When Bobby was 12, Eleanor passed away. She left him something in her will that would change his life forever. She left him her piano. It took 3 trucks and 6 men to move the grand piano into the small Bronx apartment. It barely fit. The family had to rearrange everything just to make room. But Bobby did not care. He had his piano. He had his music. Nothing else mattered. Scholarships followed. First to a prestigious music academy in Manhattan. Then to the Juilliard School, the most famous music conservatory in America. Bobby Carter was on his way to becoming one of the greatest pianists of his generation. Critics praised his technical skill and emotional depth. They said he had a gift that came along once in a lifetime. At 23, Bobby made his debut at Carnegie Hall. The concert was sold out months in advance. People flew in from Europe and Asia just to hear him play. When he walked onto that famous stage, wearing a black tuxedo that his parents had saved for 6 months to buy, his hands were steady. He sat down at the Steinway grand piano, the lights warm on his face, and he began to play. The performance lasted 2 hours. When it was over, the audience rose to their feet. The applause went on for 15 minutes. Roses flew onto the stage. Critics called it one of the greatest debut performances in Carnegie Hall history. Bobby Carter had arrived. The years that followed were golden. Bobby performed with the greatest orchestras in the world. He played in London, Paris, Vienna, Tokyo. He recorded albums that won awards. He appeared on television programs. He bought his parents a house in a nice neighborhood. He married a beautiful cellist named Maria. They had a daughter named Sophie. Life was perfect, but perfection never lasts. The trouble started small, as trouble often does. A pain in his right hand that came and went. A slight stiffness in his fingers that appeared on cold mornings. Bobby ignored it at first. He was too busy. Too successful. He had concerts scheduled for the next 2 years. He did not have time to be sick, but the pain grew worse. The stiffness spread. Some mornings, his fingers would not move at all. He went to doctors, specialists, the best in the world. They ran tests. They took x-rays. Finally, they gave him a diagnosis that stopped his heart cold: severe arthritis. Progressive and incurable. The same condition that had ended Eleanor Price's career would now end his. The doctors were clear. He might have 5 good years left. Maybe 10 if he was lucky. But eventually his hands would become too stiff to play. The career he had built, the gift he had been given, would be taken away from him piece by piece. Bobby refused to accept it. He practiced harder than ever. He played through the pain. He tried every treatment, every therapy, every experimental procedure. Nothing worked. The disease moved forward like a slow tide, unstoppable and cruel dot. As his hands grew worse, Bobby began to change. The joy that once filled his music was replaced by desperation. He became angry and bitter. He pushed away his friends. He drank too much. He stopped sleeping. Maria begged him to slow down, to accept what was happening, to find peace. But Bobby could not hear her. His final concert came when he was 41. It was in Boston, a benefit performance for a children's hospital. Bobby should not have played. His hands were worse than ever. But he insisted. He walked onto that stage with pain burning in every joint. He sat down at the piano. He lifted his hands. He made it through one song before his fingers locked completely. He tried to continue, but his hands would not obey. The audience watched in horror as the great Bobby Carter sat frozen at the piano, unable to play another note. He stood up abruptly, knocking over the bench. He walked off the stage. He never performed publicly again. What followed was a long, dark fall. Maria left and took Sophie with her. She said she could not watch him destroy himself anymore. The money disappeared, spent on failed treatments and too many bottles. The beautiful house was sold. Then the car. Then the furniture. Bobby lost everything except Eleanor's piano. He kept that piano until the very end. Even when he was living in a single room in a rundown hotel, he kept the piano. He could not play it anymore, but he would sit beside it for hours, running his gnarled fingers over the keys without pressing them. It was all he had left. Then came the fire. An electrical fault in the old hotel. Bobby escaped with his life, but the piano did not. He stood on the street in his pajamas and watched the building burn, watched the flames consume the last piece of his old life. When the firefighters finally put out the blaze, there was nothing left. Bobby Carter became invisible after that. He drifted from shelter to shelter. He slept in parks and subway stations. He ate whatever he could find. The world that once knew his name forgot he existed. Sometimes he would see young people on the street, carrying violin cases or sheet music, and his heart would break all over again. Years passed. Seasons changed. Bobby grew old on the streets. His hair turned gray. His face became lined and weathered. But something unexpected happened as well. Something miraculous. The pain in his hands began to fade. The stiffness that had stolen his career slowly retreated. Perhaps it was the change in weather. Perhaps it was something in the food he ate. Perhaps it was just luck. Whatever the reason, Bobby woke up one morning and realized he could move his fingers again. Not perfectly. Not like before. But enough that he did not tell anyone. He did not rush to find a piano. He was afraid. Afraid that it was temporary. Afraid that he had forgotten how to play. Afraid of hope itself. For 3 years, Bobby lived with this secret. He watched his hands grow stronger each day. He exercised his fingers in secret, flexing and stretching them when nobody was watching. He was preparing, waiting, building his courage, and then, on that September morning, he walked into Madison Square Park and saw the old piano sitting in the sunlight. Something inside him shifted. He knew it was time. After all these years of silence, he was ready to play again. The weeks leading up to the concert were filled with preparation and unexpected reunions. Bobby moved out of the shelter and into a small apartment that an anonymous donor had rented for him. It was nothing fancy, just a single room with a kitchen and a bathroom, but to Bobby it felt like a palace. He had a bed with clean sheets. He had a refrigerator stocked with food. He had a door that locked and a window that let in sunlight. Most importantly, he had a piano. A beautiful Steinway baby grand had been delivered on his first day in the apartment. It sat against the wall like an old friend waiting patiently for his return. Bobby spent hours with that piano, relearning pieces he had not played in decades, rebuilding the muscle memory that time had nearly stolen. His hands were not what they used to be. He had to accept that. The speed was slower. The flexibility was reduced. Some passages that once flowed easily now required careful attention. But something else had grown in place of what was lost. A depth of emotion, a weight of experience that his younger self could never have possessed. Every note he played now carried the story of his life within it. Dr. Helen Garrett traveled from Boston to meet him. She arrived at his apartment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, carrying a box of old recordings and photographs. When Bobby opened the door and saw her face, he recognized her immediately. She had been in the audience at his Carnegie Hall debut 40 years ago. She had written him letters of admiration that he never answered because he was too busy, too focused on his career. "I never forgot you," Helen said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I never stopped listening to your recordings. When you disappeared, I always hoped you were still alive somewhere. I always hoped you would play again." They sat together for hours, listening to his old performances, looking at photographs from concerts long past. Bobby saw himself as a young man, confident and ambitious, with no idea of the pain that awaited him. He saw his parents sitting proudly in the front row of concert halls. He saw Maria, beautiful Maria, standing beside him on their wedding day. "Where is Maria now?" Helen asked gently. "Where is your daughter?" Bobby's face grew heavy with sadness. "I don't know." After everything fell apart, Maria took Sophie and moved away. She didn't want Sophie to watch her father destroy himself. She was right to leave. I was not the man she had married anymore. "Have you tried to find them?" Bobby shook his head. What would I say? How could I explain all those wasted years? How could I make up for being absent when Sophie needed a father? Helen reached across the table and took his hand. "Bobby, your daughter deserves to know that her father is alive. She deserves to decide for herself whether she wants to see you again. Don't make that decision for her." Bobby thought about this for days. He practiced during the day and lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sophie. She would be 32 now. A grown woman? She might have children of her own. Grandchildren he had never met. Finally, he asked Sarah Chun for help. The reporter who had first interviewed him had become something of a friend. She used her resources to track down Maria's current address. She lived in a small town in Vermont now, remarried to a kind man who owned a bookstore. Sophie lived nearby with her husband and 2 young daughters. Bobby wrote a letter. It took him 4 days to get it right. He wrote and rewrote, scratching out sentences, starting over from the beginning. The final letter was simple and honest. He told Maria and Sophie that he was sorry. He told them that he had never stopped loving them. He told them about the years on the street and the morning when his hands started to work again. He told them about the concert at Carnegie Hall. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I am alive, and that every day I carry the memory of our family in my heart. If Sophie ever wants to meet me, I would welcome the chance to see her face again. But I understand if that's not possible." He mailed the letter and tried not to hope too much. He focused on his practice, on preparing for the biggest performance of his life. He had chosen a challenging program: Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, and Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece he had played in the park. He wanted to show the world that he was still capable of greatness. 2 weeks before the concert, a response arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address was from Vermont. Bobby's hands shook so badly he could barely open it. The letter was from Sophie. She had written 3 pages in careful, precise handwriting. Bobby read every word with tears running down his face. "Dear Dad," the letter began. I want you to know that reading your letter was the most emotional experience of my life. Mom and I cried for hours. We thought you were dead. We really did. When we saw you on the news, we couldn't believe it. We watched that video 100 times just to convince ourselves it was real. Sophie wrote about her life. About her husband, a schoolteacher named Michael. About her daughters, Emma and Grace, ages 5 and 7. About the years of wondering what had happened to her father, the anger she had felt, the sadness that never quite went away. I won't pretend that everything is okay, she wrote. There's a lot of pain that needs healing, a lot of lost time that we can never get back. But you're my father. You taught me to love music. You held my hand when I was scared. Before everything went wrong, you were my hero. I think I'd like to try to find that person again. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number. Bobby stared at it for hours before finding the courage to dial. The conversation was awkward at first. Father and daughter spoke carefully, not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to break the fragile connection they were rebuilding. But gradually the tension eased. Sophie's voice, which had sounded guarded at first, began to warm. She told Bobby about her girls, about how Emma was learning to play piano just like her grandfather once had. She watches your old videos on YouTube, Sophie said. And Bobby could hear the smile in her voice. She tells everyone at school that her grandpa is a famous piano player. She doesn't know you were homeless. She just knows you're famous now. Bobby laughed, and then he cried, and then he laughed again. For the first time in 20 years, he was talking to his daughter. For the first time in 20 years, he felt like a father again. I want to come to the concert, Sophie said. Mom and I both want to come. We want to be there to see you play. Bobby could not speak. His voice was trapped somewhere between joy and grief. He simply nodded, even though she could not see him, and whispered, yes, through his tears. The reunion happened 3 days before the concert. Bobby waited in his small apartment, wearing the nicest clothes he owned, his heart pounding in his chest. When the knock came at the door, he had to steady himself against the wall before answering. Sophie stood in the hallway, a beautiful woman with her mother's eyes and her father's high cheekbones. Maria stood beside her, older now, with gray streaks in her hair, but still lovely. They looked at Bobby and he looked at them, and for a moment nobody knew what to do. Then Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her father. Bobby held her tight, feeling her shoulders shake with sobs, feeling his own tears fall into her hair. Maria joined them, and the three stood together in a trembling embrace. Trying to heal decades of separation in a single moment, they talked for hours. They looked at photographs. They shared stories of the years they had spent apart. Emma and Grace arrived later, shy at first but warming quickly to the grandfather they had only known from videos. Emma asked Bobby to play something on his piano, and he played a simple melody that he had composed for Sophie when she was born. Sophie listened with tears streaming down her face. She remembered that melody. It had been the lullaby her father had played for her every night before bed, back when life was good. Back when everything seemed possible. You remembered, she whispered. I never forgot, Bobby replied. Even when I forgot myself, I never forgot you. The evening ended with plans and promises. Sophie and Maria would be in the front row at Carnegie Hall. Emma and Grace would be there too, witnessing their grandfather's return to glory. For the first time in decades, Bobby Carter would perform for his family. For the first time in decades, he would not be alone. The night of the concert arrived with the kind of cold, clear weather that makes New York City sparkle. Limousines lined up outside Carnegie Hall, their headlights glinting in the darkness. Crowds gathered on the sidewalks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the celebrities and dignitaries who had come to witness the performance. The event had been sold out for weeks. Tickets had been resold online for thousands of dollars. Television cameras stood ready to broadcast the concert to millions of viewers around the world. Inside the legendary hall, the audience took their seats with an excitement that crackled like electricity. Music critics from the most prestigious publications in the world sat in the press section, notebooks ready. Famous musicians and composers occupied prime seats, eager to see if the legend could reclaim his glory. Ordinary people who had been moved by the viral video filled the remaining spaces. Their eyes wide with anticipation. In the front row sat Sophie, Maria, Emma, and Grace. Emma wore a special dress that her mother had bought for the occasion, dark blue with tiny silver stars. Grace clutched a small bouquet of flowers that she planned to give her grandfather after the show. Sophie held Maria's hand tightly, their old conflicts forgotten. United by love for the man who would soon walk onto that stage, backstage, Bobby Carter stood alone in his dressing room. He wore a new black tuxedo, tailored perfectly to his thin frame. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His gray hair had been neatly trimmed. He looked for the first time in decades like the man he used to be, but inside, he was terrified. His hands trembled as he practiced scales on an imaginary keyboard. His heart raced so fast he could feel it in his throat. What if he failed? What if the pressure was too much? What if his hands locked up again, right there on stage in front of the whole world? He thought about running. He thought about slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. Nobody would blame him. After everything he had been through, surely he deserved to escape this crushing expectation. Then he looked at the photograph he had brought with him. It was old and creased, rescued from a box that Sophie had kept all these years. The picture showed a young Bobby at his first piano recital, age 6, sitting on a bench that was too tall for him, his feet dangling above the floor. Eleanor Price stood beside him, her hand resting proudly on his shoulder. Bobby remembered what Eleanor had told him before that first performance. "Don't play for the audience," she had said. "Play for the music? The music will never let you down." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought about Eleanor, who had believed in him when he was nobody. He thought about his parents, who had sacrificed so much to give him a chance. He thought about Sophie and Maria and his grandchildren, waiting in the audience, ready to witness his return. He opened his eyes. The trembling stopped. A calm settled over him like a warm blanket. He knew what he had to do. A stagehand knocked on the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Carter." Bobby nodded. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the stage. The roar of the audience hit him like a wave when he stepped into the light. 2,800 people rose to their feet as one, applauding before he had even played a single note. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Bobby stood at the edge of the stage, overwhelmed by the sound, by the love, by the sheer magnitude of the moment. He saw his family in the front row. Emma was jumping up and down with excitement. Grace waved her flowers. Sophie was crying already, tears of joy streaming down her face. Maria blew him a kiss. Bobby walked to the piano. The famous Steinway Concert Grand gleamed under the lights, its black surface reflecting the golden glow of the hall. He sat down on the bench and adjusted his position. The applause finally faded. Silence fell. 2,800 people held their breath. Bobby placed his hands on the keys. He felt the cool ivory beneath his fingers. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He felt the ghosts of all his performances past, watching from the shadows, and then he began to play. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata floated into the air. Gentle, mournful, hauntingly beautiful. Bobby's fingers moved with a softness that belied their age and experience. Each note was placed with perfect precision, like drops of rain falling into still water. The audience was transfixed. Critics who had come prepared to judge found themselves simply listening. Musicians who understood the technical difficulty of what they were hearing forgot about technique and surrendered to the emotion. Ordinary people who knew nothing about classical music discovered something new and wonderful. Bobby played the entire first movement without a single mistake. When it ended, the silence that followed was deeper than any applause. People were afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. The second movement came faster, more complex. Bobby's hands danced across the keyboard with increasing confidence. The music swelled and retreated, built and released, took the audience on a journey through emotions they could not name. Then came the third movement. Fast and passionate, a torrent of notes that tested the limits of human ability. Bobby attacked the keys with fierce determination. His body swayed with the rhythm. Sweat appeared on his forehead. He was giving everything he had, holding nothing back. When the final chord crashed into silence, the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People screamed and cheered. Some were openly weeping. Bobby sat still for a moment, catching his breath, letting the wave of sound wash over him. He stood and bowed. The applause continued. He sat down again. The list came next, a piece of technical brilliance that left the audience gasping. Bobby's hands moved so fast they seemed to blur. Notes flew through the air like birds taking flight. The music was joyous and wild, filled with the spirit of life itself. By the time he finished, several audience members had risen to their feet again, unable to contain their excitement. Bobby bowed once more, a smile crossing his weathered face. He was finding joy in this. He was remembering why he had first fallen in love with music. Then came the final piece. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The same piece he had played in the park on that September morning. The piece that had started all of this. The hall fell completely silent. Everyone knew the significance of this moment. They had all seen the video. They had all watched him play this same piece on a broken piano in a public park. Now they would hear it as it was meant to be played on the greatest stage in the world. Bobby closed his eyes. He thought about his journey. From the Bronx to Carnegie Hall, from Carnegie Hall to the streets. From the streets back to Carnegie Hall, every moment of pain and joy, every failure and triumph, had led to this single instant in time. He opened his eyes and began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall that night was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. It was more than notes on a page. It was more than fingers on keys. It was the story of a human life, told through sound, expressed through passion, delivered straight from the soul. Bobby played with everything he had. He played for Eleanor, who had first shown him the magic of music. He played for his parents, who had given him everything. He played for Maria and Sophie, whom he had lost and found again. He played for all the people who had ever been forgotten, ever been invisible, ever been told that their best days were behind them. The climax came like a thunderstorm, powerful and overwhelming. Bobby's hands crashed down on the keys, releasing waves of sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. The music roared and swelled, filling every corner of that legendary space with pure, undiluted beauty, and then slowly, gently, the storm subsided. The final notes drifted into the air like leaves falling from a tree, soft, peaceful, complete. Bobby lifted his hands from the keys. The last echo of sound faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The audience sat frozen, suspended between the world of music and the world of reality. Then the dam broke. The audience exploded in the most thunderous standing ovation Carnegie Hall had witnessed in decades. The sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave of applause and cheers and screams of joy. People were on their feet, tears streaming down their faces, their hands coming together again and again. Bobby stood and turned to face them. He saw his family in the front row, all of them crying, all of them clapping, all of them looking at him with love and pride. Little Emma was jumping up and down, shouting, "Grandpa! Grandpa!" At the top of her lungs, the applause went on for 15 minutes. Bobby bowed again and again. Roses flew onto the stage, covering the floor in a carpet of red. Critics, who had prepared skeptical reviews, tore up their notes and started fresh. Bobby Carter had made history. Not just by playing brilliantly, but by proving that redemption was possible. That second chances were real. That no matter how far you fall, you can always find your way back to the light. The morning after the concert, Bobby Carter woke up to a world that had completely transformed. His name dominated headlines across the globe. "The greatest comeback in music history," declared one newspaper. "From Park Bench to Carnegie Hall," announced another. Television programs fought for exclusive interviews. Book publishers offered contracts worth millions of dollars. Film studios wanted to turn his life into a movie. Bobby sat in his small apartment, reading the reviews and messages that had poured in overnight. Critics who had once written him off as a relic of the past now praised him as a living legend. Musicians he had never met sent letters of admiration and respect. Thousands of ordinary people shared stories of how his performance had touched their lives. had inspired them to pursue their own forgotten dreams, but the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. It was an email from a homeless shelter in Chicago, written by a man named Thomas who had been living on the streets for 8 years. Thomas had watched the Carnegie Hall performance on a television in a community room. He had wept through the entire show. "You gave me hope," Thomas wrote. "For the first time in years, I believe that my life is not over. If you can come back from the streets and play at Carnegie Hall, maybe I can find my way back too. Thank you for showing me that miracles are possible." Bobby read that email again and again. He understood, perhaps more clearly than he ever had before, that his story was bigger than himself. His journey had become a symbol of hope for everyone who had ever been lost, ever been forgotten, ever been told that they had no value. He knew what he had to do next. Within weeks, Bobby established the Second Chance Foundation. The organization was dedicated to helping homeless individuals with artistic talents reconnect with their gifts. Bobby donated most of his concert earnings to the foundation. He recruited volunteers from music schools and art academies. He convinced wealthy donors to contribute funds for instruments, supplies, and performance spaces. The foundation opened its first center in New York City, in the same neighborhood where Bobby had spent his hardest years. A converted warehouse became a sanctuary for forgotten artists. Piano keyboards lined one wall. Easels and canvases filled another. A small stage stood at one end where residents could perform for each other. Bobby visited the center every week. He sat down with people who reminded him of himself, people who had lost everything, and he taught them to play again. Not just piano, but life. He showed them that talent does not disappear just because circumstances do. He proved that the spark inside them could be rekindled. No matter how long it had been dormant, the first graduate of the Second Chance program was a woman named Rosa. She had been a promising jazz singer before addiction had claimed her career and her home. After 6 months in the program, Rosa performed at a small club in Greenwich Village. Bobby sat in the audience, tears running down his face. As Rosa sang with a voice that had been silent for 15 years, more graduates followed. A painter who had lost everything in a divorce now had work hanging in galleries. A violinist who had spent years begging on subway platforms now performed with a community orchestra. A poet who had not written a word in a decade now published a collection that received critical acclaim. The program expanded to other cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Each new center carried Bobby's spirit of hope and redemption. Each new graduate proved that his story was not unique, that there were thousands of talented people waiting to be rediscovered. Meanwhile, Bobby's own career continued to flourish. He performed at concert halls around the world, though he limited his schedule to spend time with his family. Sophie and Michael had moved to New York with their daughters, wanting to be closer to the grandfather who had returned from the dead. Bobby spent countless hours with Emma and Grace, teaching them piano, telling them stories, making up for all the years he had missed. Emma showed remarkable talent at the keyboard. By age 7, she was already performing simple pieces with confidence and grace. Bobby saw in her the same spark that Eleanor Price had seen in him so many years ago. He wondered if this was how the cycle worked, if gifts were passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. On the first anniversary of his Carnegie Hall comeback, Bobby returned to Madison Square Park. The old public piano was still there, though it had been repaired and refinished since his famous performance. A small plaque now stood beside it, commemorating the moment that had changed everything. A crowd gathered as Bobby approached the piano. People recognized him immediately. Phones came out, just as they had a year before. But this time, there was no laughter, no mockery. Only respect and anticipation. Bobby sat down at the bench and ran his fingers over the keys. The piano felt different now, smoother and more responsive. But the magic was the same. The connection between man and instrument remained as powerful as ever. He played a simple piece, something gentle and intimate, not meant to impress but simply to celebrate. The music drifted across the park, drawing more listeners with each passing note. By the time he finished, hundreds of people surrounded the piano, Their faces filled with wonder, Bobby stood and looked out at the crowd. He saw young and old, rich and poor, every color and background imaginable. He saw himself in their faces, saw the hopes and fears that every human being carries inside. 1 year ago, he said, his voice carrying across the silent park, I sat at this piano with nothing. No home, no family, no future. I thought my life was over. I thought music had abandoned me forever. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I was wrong. Music never abandoned me. I abandoned myself. I let shame and fear convince me that I had nothing left to offer. I forgot that the greatest gift we have is not talent or success or fame. It is the simple ability to try again, to get back up when we fall, to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Tears were forming in the eyes of those who listened. Bobby continued, wherever you are in your life, whatever you have lost or whatever you fear, please remember this, it is never too late. Your story is not over. The best chapter might still be waiting to be written. All you have to do is have the courage to sit down at your own piano, whatever that piano might be, and start playing. The crowd erupted in applause. People cheered and wept and held each other. Strangers embraced like old friends. The moment captured everything that Bobby's story represented: hope, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. Years passed. Bobby Carter continued to perform, continued to teach, continued to inspire. The Second Chance Foundation grew into an international organization that helped thousands of forgotten artists find their way back to their gifts. His story was told in books and films and documentaries, reaching millions of people around the world. When journalists asked Bobby about his legacy, he always gave the same answer. He did not want to be remembered as the homeless man who played at Carnegie Hall. He wanted to be remembered as proof that every person has value, that every life contains possibility, that every ending can become a new beginning. He spent his final years surrounded by love. Sophie and Maria were constants in his life. The wounds of the past healed through time and forgiveness. Emma became a concert pianist herself, carrying her grandfather's gift into a new generation. Grace became a music therapist, helping children find expression through sound. Bobby passed away peacefully at the age of 81, with his family gathered around him and his favorite Chopin playing softly in the background. His last words were simple and fitting: play for the music. The music will never let you down. At his memorial service, the park piano where everything began played one final time. Hundreds of former students and graduates of his program took turns at the keyboard, each one playing a few notes, passing the music from hand to hand like a torch being carried forward. The story of Bobby Carter did not end with his death. It continued in every person who watched his video and found courage. It continued in every forgotten artist who rediscovered their gift. It continued in every child who sat down at a piano for the first time, eyes wide with wonder, ready to discover the magic that lived inside them that morning in Madison Square Park. When an old homeless man asked to play a broken piano and made the world stop and listen, something remarkable happened. A single act of courage changed millions of lives. A single performance proved that no matter how far we fall, we can always rise again. Bobby Carter asked a simple question: can I play that old piano? The world laughed. Then he made history. And in doing so, he reminded us all that the most powerful music comes not from perfect hands, but from a heart that refuses to give up.